Israel's brutal war on Gaza continues, and Israel is facing a case of genocide at the International Court of Justice. But are we at a turning point for Western support of Israel? And what future is there for Gaza and for Palestine more broadly? Earlier, I went to New York to speak to one of the foremost scholars on Israel-Palestine, Norman Finkelstein. Professor Norman Finkelstein, thanks so much for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you for having me.
You've been an advocate for Palestinian freedom for decades. You devoted much of your life, certainly your scholarship, to this. You're also the child of Holocaust survivors. Your parents were in the Warsaw ghettos during the uprising. They were both taken to concentration camps. Your father was even in the Auschwitz death march. How do experiences like this inform your work?
Well, first of all, I came from a very political home. That was just a fluke of fate. No other people who survived, they weren't steeped in, immersed in, passionate about politics. My parents were. Actually, I'm not sure if this is the best way to begin the interview, but my parents had a very turbulent, tormented marriage. I think both of them never really recovered from what happened to them and what happened to their families on both sides. Every member of the family was exterminated. And so it was not a happy marriage. But I remember my mother once saying to me that for all the horrors of the marriage, we never disagreed on politics, meaning she and my father. And they had very strange politics by current standards. They were both fanatically pro-Soviet, pro-Russian, because they looked at the world through the lens of the Nazi Holocaust. And the Soviet Union defeated the Nazis. There's no question about that. 90% of the German troops, the army, they were fighting on the Eastern Front. My parents were fanatical Stalinists. Long after the Soviet Union had distanced itself from Stalin, the famous speech by Khrushchev in 1956, my parents would not brook any criticism of Stalin till their death, till their last days, their last breaths. And I think they were probably the only two Stalinists left in the world. It was very funny when let's say when I was in 7th grade, the teacher was Josh Abramson. And we were discussing World War II, and I didn't know better. I was defending Stalin and Russia and singing their praises. I remember the teacher, Mr. Abramson, he said that, you realize how many people Stalin killed? So what do I know in 7th grade? So I went home and I said to my mother, do you realize how many people Stalin killed? And she said, well, Stalin said that this generation is going to suffer, but the next generation will live better. Next day I go into school, raise my hand. Stalin said this generation will suffer, but the next generation will live better. So Mr. Abramson says, in other words, you're saying, Mr. Finkelstein, he did call us by our surnames. He said, in other words, Mr. Finkelstein, you're saying that the ends justify the means. Well, I didn't have a clue what that meant. But I went home and I said to my mother, in other words, Mom, you're saying the ends justify the means. And she said, well, in this case, yes. And I went back and I just repeated. I hadn't a clue what I was talking about, obviously.
So you've been riling people up for years.
Well, I wasn't intentionally doing it, but you understand that at that age, you're very influenced by your parents.
Yeah.
I remember in 6th grade, it was 1964, and it was the presidential election. It was between Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater. And my parents were very against 64, before being anti-war was popular. They were very anti the Vietnam War. And I came to class one day and I raised my hand and I said, well, in my opinion, President Johnson is belligerent, okay? The teacher said, sit down, you don't even know what the word means.
I think I've heard you say something like that in interviews before. I've been watching you on the internet lately. Let me ask you something, though, because you are a controversial voice, clearly since middle school. you're one
Great
of
scholar. I'm correcting you.
you're one of the leading, scholars in the world on this topic, but you're also one of the most controversial ones. I mean, you've been called, quote, the foremost Jewish anti-Semite on planet Earth. Some people even call you a Holocaust denier. Why does your work generate these types of responses?
I think it's a kind of paradox, to tell you the truth, because as you well know, my actual political opinions are very conventional and well within the mainstream. For example, long after the whole of the left went over to this notion of one state, I was still advocating two states.
Yeah.
Whereas the whole left was trying to anchor their thinking in things like settler colonialism and this and that, I was very firm in just repeating what international law said. I thought that was the best vocabulary to try to reach a broad audience. So the controversial part comes, I think, from there's a certain element of, I will say, fanaticism to me, which is I read everything and I'm ready to cite chapter and verse and everything. So I don't give my, so to speak, adversaries any wiggle room. There's not a kind of debate. No, I go in for the kill.
Yes.
You're lying. That's not true. That's false. And I am relentless. I know that. I'm relentless because I think it's a kind of ideological war. And I am relentless. I know that, but that's because I do the work.
Have you lost faith in those in those reference points and those frameworks? I mean, I noticed you used past tense when you said, "I held on to the two-state idea. I believed in international law." Do you now no longer have faith that those are effective frameworks for getting a practical outcome?
Okay, those are two separate questions.
Yeah.
On the question of international law, obviously it moves very slowly. Painfully slowly when people are being killed in a genocide. And so there's a certain degree of more than impatience, there's a degree of indignation. So, for example, on the car ride over here, I was reading the new International Court of Justice response to South Africa. And it goes on for about 12 pages. And they say, we have to first consider this point. We have to first consider that point. And we have to first consider this, that, and that. All right, come on, guys. Let's just cut to the chase. People are getting killed. People are dying of starvation. But on the other hand, I have to say there's a kind of, I don't know, I was kind of touched by the fact that at the end of the day, the law at a huge price for the people of Gaza, but the law seems to be kicking into place. And for example, right now, as we speak, 31% of children under the age of 2 are facing acute malnutrition in the northern part of Gaza. They went through the evidence and they concluded, no, Israel has got to let the food in, It took 12 pages. It took 6 months. But the law is, kicking in. So,
but will the food be let in? I mean, we saw after the January decision,
I know.
Not much changed.
I know. And then what do you do? On the one hand, it's a very slow, tedious process, while the numbers are since the January 26th decision of the court, 5,000 more people have been killed. So yeah, it's.
So then, why do you have any optimism that any of this matters? Particularly because I think about in 2020 when you actually stopped writing on Gaza, and you said you felt like the work you were doing was sort of, I think you said pointless and purposeless. Why is it less pointless and purposeless now when we see legal decisions coming out, international outrage, and yet Israel's still remaining fairly obstinate?
I guess the simple answer is twofold. Number one, if you do nothing, you can be certain nothing will happen. So that's not an option. And the second thing is that you do see changes. I mean, it's not what you would want, obviously, but you do see change. The ICJ, first of all, The fact that South Africa went to bat for Palestine,
Extraordinary.
you know, not one Arab state, not one Arab state. It took South Africa, you know. The fact that the vote was 14-2. I said, this is impossible before the vote. I kept counting. I could only come up with 6 countries that would
Really?
vote for.
Wow.
I would have bet every single dollar I owned that it was impossible that the US and Germany would vote yes. There are grounds to be optimistic. Not the least, for me, the most optimistic thing is the young people. If you had told me that people were going to keep coming out for demonstrations week after week after week after week, for 6 months, I would never have believed it. The tenacity, the conviction, you know, it's really an extraordinary sight to behold. You know, somebody said, I was at a demonstration 3 weeks ago. It was at Washington Square Park in Manhattan. It was pouring rain. And it was a Saturday. And there were about 50,000 people there. And they were all around 25. I was an age cohort of 1. And then there was a gap, literally, there was a gap of 40 years, you know? And then after it was over, a lot of people went down to the subway to go home. And so in the subway platform, on this side of the train tracks and then on the other side of the train tracks, everyone's still chanting. Everyone's still chanting. If you know the scenes from the civil rights movement in the United States, how when they were in jail, they kept singing and they kept chanting, and they kept singing and they kept chanting. And it was like these young people, except there's one difference. The people in the civil rights movement were fighting for their own rights.
Right.
These were young people fighting for Gaza, you know? 2 million people in some ghetto way off in the Middle East. It's deeply inspiring.
No, absolutely.
So there's every reason on those grounds, both to be proud of, you know, the capacity of human sympathy and solidarity, but also on the grounds of being hopeful.
One of the things you talked about was how arguments that were on the margins have shifted, at least to the mainstream, to be debated. They're now debatable.
Correct.
They're engageable.
And they no longer can be shot down with you're an anti-Semite.
Right.
Those days are over.
You made an argument recently that turned some heads, to be sure. You said that Hamas's October 7th attack was comparable in some ways to Nat Turner's slave revolt, a rebellion of enslaved Black Americans in Virginia that took place in 1831. You've also referred to Gaza frequently as a concentration camp. Those types of historical comparisons probably aren't in the mainstream yet. In fact, they offend some people, they outrage some people. Why do you make them?
Well, the primary reason I make them is because I think they're true. Now, the Nat Turner Rebellion was replete with the most horrifying atrocities. The order Nat Turner, for those of you who don't know, because I don't know what your audience is, the United States had not a lot, but it had slave rebellions before the Civil War. And the best known one and the most famous one was the Nat Turner Rebellion. They killed about 60 people in the Nat Turner Rebellion. The order given by Nat Turner, according to the historians, the order was very straightforward. Kill all whites. That was the order. Kill all whites. And they proceeded to do just that. So when I read that, a light went on in my head, and I said, okay, now I have something roughly analogous to October 7th. So now my next challenge is, okay, so how do you render a judgment on the Nat Turner Rebellion? So I figured I would go to the people who were, so to speak, closest to me in my political trajectory, which would be the abolitionists, those who were fighting for the end of slavery. However, they were very strictly against the use of violence. And So I was curious, okay, how did they judge, assess the Nat Turner Rebellion? And so I turned to William Lloyd Garrison, who was one of the most famous of the abolitionists. He edited the newspaper called The Liberator. And it's very worth reading it, what he said. He began by saying, "We told you so," because he was speaking to white people. "We told you so. We told you, if you keep treating people this way, if you treat them this way, there's going to be a reaction." And he went on to say that, of course, atrocities, or I think he called it horrors, occurred during the Nat Turner Rebellion. But if you read the statement from start to finish, he never condemned Nat Turner. He does not. It's, you know, it was for me an epiphanal moment, because I spent the last 15 or more years of my life chronicling the horrors in Gaza. The fact that those folks who burst the gates of Gaza on October 7th had been born into a concentration camp. Not only were they born into it, but they were living in it, and they were destined to die in it. And that was Nat Turner.
But is this an explanation from a dispassionate scholar who's simply saying, look how inevitable this violence on October 7th was? Or is it an endorsement of the action by saying, look, they had no choice. This is literally the only legitimate and morally acceptable option they could make?
Look, when you pass moral judgments, in my opinion, you have to offer options. What else could they have done? So, when Hamas was elected in 2006...
But you've just talked about the international courts, right? So you have a growing optimism.
Yeah.
Does that stuff only happen because of the armed resistance? In other words, would we have the world's attention? Would there be...
I'm going to say what the facts tell me. Now, I'm not saying I'm the only person in possession of the facts, but the facts as they tell me. In 2006, when Hamas was elected, it was elected on a reform platform because the Palestinian Authority is so corrupt, people wanted to change. If you study, immediately as they were elected, the international community, first Israel, then the US, then the EU, imposed this brutal economic blockade on Gaza. Now, if you study the record, Hamas was attempting a diplomatic solution to the conflict. It talked about recognizing Israel, 2 states, having a long-term ceasefire. It made many options. All of it was rebuffed. All of it was rejected. Then, in March 2018, they attempted the Great March of Return, a nonviolent civil resistance. What happened? Well, we know exactly what happened. A UN investigative body produced a report. It was 250 single-spaced pages. According to the report, Israel deliberately targeted children. Israel deliberately targeted medics. Israel deliberately targeted journalists. And here's the best one of all. Israel deliberately targeted disabled people. Okay? And they have the descriptions in the report. A person in the distance on crutches, 300 meters from the perimeter fence, shot in the head. A person in the wheelchair, 200 meters, shot down. So, of course, the nonviolence is going to fail. If people are just being shot down like, swatted down like flies, and there's no international reaction, it can't work. The whole premise of nonviolent civil resistance is that if you're willing to incur the suffering, then the international community, or in the case of our own country during the civil rights movement, the North and the federal government will be moved by the violence, moved in sympathy to act. When you show the violence, remember the whole point of nonviolence as Martin Luther King understood it. If you read, for example, the letter from the Birmingham jail, he says that violence is embedded in the system. And all we're doing is we're bringing it to the surface.
They're dramatizing it and putting a spectacle on it.
Exactly, in order to evoke sympathy.
But does it work if everyone's white? The reason I ask
that's what I'm going to say.
Oh.
You answered, that's the point. It didn't work in Gaza. It didn't work. So now you're at the heart of the dilemma. If diplomacy didn't work, they tried. I'm not saying what they were saying was perfect. I'm not saying it wouldn't have required, intense negotiations to make it work, but there were steps taken by Hamas. That didn't work. Nonviolent civil resistance didn't work. And by the time you got to October 6th, it was clear that a deal was going to be made with the Saudis. And then the whole conflict between Israel and the Arab world would have been resolved above the heads of the people of Gaza. And the only thing those 2 million people would have to look forward to is to languish and die in that concentration camp. So
your critics, though, would say there was at least an opportunity for hope or possibility. Now there's almost 33,000 people dead, 8,000 into the rubble, schools destroyed, almost entire built environment destroyed.
I'm not going to defend that. I'm not going to even defend the action.
But I guess I mean is ultimately was it a successful plan?
I think that politics is a very unpredictable business. So let me give you the analogy, and then you can answer me. Yeah. When Nat Turner carries out his rebellion, the immediate reaction was the whites in the South went on a lunatic rampage. They randomly killed about 120 black people just off the street, as you can imagine what happened. Yeah. And then another 80 were killed, died after being convicted in court. So about 200 black people were killed. That was the first consequence. So many a person like yourself would say, was it worth it? 61 white people were killed and now 200 of us were killed. Was it worth it? What was the second thing that happened? The law changed. After Nat Turner, they passed the law, black people can't learn how to read. Because Nat Turner was very literate. I said he knew the Bible and he was very smart. So they prohibited teaching a black person to read. Third thing that happened, they prohibited black people from congregating together, okay? Because the people thought he was giving sermons to the black people, and instead it turned out they were plotting the rebellion, okay? So someone like you would say, did that make any sense? Was it worth it? Right. 200 black people were killed, or 30,000 Gazans were killed. The law is now more repressive than ever, okay? So there's an argument there. But then along comes John Brown. And when you read John Brown, he says, I was inspired by Nat Turner, okay? So then you could say, well, John Brown, what did he accomplish? His uprising was put down in about a couple of days. He was executed, okay? But then along comes Frederick Douglass, and he delivers his famous speech on John Brown, one of his best, in my opinion. And he says, he goes through all the arguments. John Brown was a failure for this reason. John Brown was a failure for that reason. John Brown was a failure for this reason. And John Brown, Nat Turner was a religious fanatic, so was John Brown. John Brown was just like Nat Turner. He was convinced he was a vessel of God and slavery was an abomination, which it was, but most people didn't believe it was that degree of abomination that you're going to give your life for it, okay? So along comes Frederick Douglass, and he says, there's a straight arrow line from John Brown to the Civil War. Nat Turner, John Brown, Civil War. Now, I know I leave out a lot of other factors, but it was a way station to the Civil War. And now Nat Turner occupies an honored place in American history.
Yeah.
So I say, I know people won't like it when I say it, but I think it's a question mark how October 7th is going to be regarded
So,
in the
so
future. If Nat Turner now occupies an honored place, I think it's a question mark.
and I think part of that will depend on Israel's response and continued
Mhm.
response. I mean, what do you think, given all the destruction, all the death
Mhm.
of people and the physical environment, what do you think Netanyahu's ultimate end game is here?
The goal is uh, at one end of a spectrum, and the spectrum bleeds into each point, bleeds into each other. At one end is the ethnic cleansing, to just get rid of them, do what they did in 1948, and put an end to this Gaza problem.
But is that a realistic vision? I mean, I understand the idea of saying we're going to have civil and governmental control
Hmm.
over Gaza. We're going to maybe reinstall settlements as the pre-night 2006
I
time.
doubt that.
Right, but it seems equally doubtful that they could depopulate the
Well,
entire
okay.
strip.
Let's remember, uh, time moves quickly. The first 2 weeks, it looked like, or they believed, that they were going to be able to expel the population to the Sinai. But at that point, Egypt made a firm decision they're not coming in.
Yeah.
So one goal was the ethnic cleansing, but I agree with you. After 2 weeks, it seemed less plausible, though it still might happen. We don't know, the pressures that will be exerted on Sisi. Number two, the sort of middle position was the one that was advocated by Giora Island, the former head of the National Security Council. He said, we'll give them two choices: stay and starve or leave. In other words, make Gaza uninhabitable. And then the extreme position was to just carry out, a destruction of Amalek, to just wipe out the population in a kind of unnuanced genocide.
Yeah.
So I think those are the three positions, and what will come of it.
What do you think is most likely to come of those three positions?
What's most like, I think, uh, because President Biden is having trouble with that a large part of that Democratic base, I think the Gallup poll showed that only 19% of Democrats supported what Israel is doing.
Yeah.
I think the pressures exerted by Biden will become unbearable for Israel. And the United States could.
What is that? What is unbearable? Will it be another profiling courage like we saw at the Security Council where they just abstained?
No, look, if the United States wanted to stop it from day one, it could have stopped it. You just pick up the phone and say, no more veto, no more weapons. It's over. And it's over. There's no question about
Is
that.
that possible as a practical matter, given this special relationship that the U.S. has had since the 60s?
Well, it's possible. The question is the political will. And right now, President Biden is balancing the what they consider to be their security interests. Because, what happened on October 7th was a blow for the United States security also. Because the United States has invested a lot in Israel as a regional power and able to be a regional arbiter.
Let me pause you on that for a second, because I spoke the other day to Professor Mearsheimer, who said that it's a myth that there's still a strategic and tactical interest for the United States to support Israel. That may have once been the case, but it's not anymore.
Look, John Mearsheimer is a good friend of mine. I like him.
But
we don't agree. I mean, people can agree to disagree. I don't agree on that point. I think the important thing to understand about Israel is very much like a Western society. It has the same kind of bureaucracy, rationality, modern outlook that makes it very easy for the U.S. to communicate with Israel. And communication is not a trivial part. The security people, the intelligence people, they all have the same mental outlook. And so that's an irreplaceable factor for the U.S. to have a what's sometimes called a stationary aircraft carrier in the Middle East, where the whole mental outlook is held in common. Also, it's still by far the most militarily competent. I'm not saying it's great.
It took a hit reputationally as
Yeah, it
well.
took a very big hit reputationally, and I don't think that was an accident. The rot has set in Israeli society. It's become westernized, and that means there's an element of slovenliness to the way they conduct themselves. You said you watched the debate I had
Yes,
with
your epic, almost 5-hour debate with Muayin Rabbani and Benny Morris and
and something else. Yeah.
Destiny.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it was striking. At the very end of the debate, I said that Israel now faces a strategic dilemma, a serious strategic dilemma. The dilemma is that a large number of people in the Arab world after October 7th suddenly came to the realization or the epiphany, Israel's not as strong as we thought it was, or Israel's not as invincible as we thought it was.
Yeah.
And Benny Morris, at that point, Professor Morris, very smart guy, he kind of had a nervous laugh and he said, that's ridiculous. We have atomic bomb, we have nuclear weapons.
Right.
What was striking to me about that answer was he didn't say, we have the IDF, we have the army. He had lost faith in it. So now he had to talk about the deterrence of their nuclear weapons. So I don't believe that October 7th was a passing error, mistake, a moment of incompetence. It was a reflection of the fact that Israel no longer is what it once was. Now, of course,
Are they going to flex their muscles, though, to prove that they actually do have capacity?
well, that's what they're doing now.
Goading, perhaps, Hezbollah. Obviously, we also have the Houthis in the Red Sea, who with their sea blockade, and we also have the Hamas issue. I mean, there's a thought here that to show that they're still invincible.
I think that's a very big problem there.
Yeah.
I think the problem is that Israel has one of its central military concepts, this is what it calls its deterrence capability. And deterrence capability is just a fancy term for the Arab world's fear of us. And they are very worried now that the Arab world, because of what happened on October 7th, no longer fears them. And so one of the reasons for what's been happening is, in their language, to restore their deterrence capacity. And that does seem to include against Hezbollah. So I think we're very far from the end of what began on October 7th, and it could take forms which will be a regional and maybe a global catastrophe.
Professor Finkelstein, thanks so much for joining me on UpFront.
You're
It's a pleasure
welcome.
talking to you.